The man who would kill Mary Catherine Edwards in 1995 had, 13 years earlier, invited her to stand in his wedding as one of his bridesmaids. She stood for him in that wedding in Beaumont, Texas, in the summer of 1982. Her twin sister, Allison, stood next to her. The groom was a young man named Clayton Foreman, a recent graduate of their shared high school. The bride was, at the time, his girlfriend of several years. Mary held the flowers. She smiled for the photograph. She did everything that a bridesmaid does at a young American wedding in a small Texas city in the early 1980s. 13 years later, Clayton Forman drove from his home in Ohio to Beaumont, Texas, and let himself into Mary Catherine Edwards' apartment. He handcuffed her behind her back. He sexually assaulted her. He killed her. It would take 26 years for the Texas Rangers and the Beaumont police to put his name to what he had done. When they finally came for him, on an April afternoon in 2021, in a suburban neighborhood in Ohio, where he had been spending his days driving for Uber, they placed him in handcuffs. They used the same pair of handcuffs he had placed on Mary in 1995. This is the case of Mary Catherine Edwards and of the handcuffs that held her, and eventually, him. Mary was 31 years old at the time of her death. She taught elementary school at Price Elementary in Beaumont, first grade, the age group where the teacher still reads to the children after lunch. She had a twin sister, Allison, with whom she was close. She had parents who lived nearby. She called them often. On the morning of January 14, 1995, her parents had not heard from her for several days. She had not answered the phone. She had not returned messages. This was not like her. Her parents drove over to her apartment and let themselves in with a spare key. They found her in the bathroom. She had been handcuffed behind her back. She had been sexually assaulted. The initial medical examiner's ruling, issued within days of her death, concluded that she had drowned in the bathtub, that her attacker had incapacitated her, had placed her in the water, and had left her to die. The ruling was, in the forensic record of the case, incomplete. 29 years later, during the trial of her killer, a subsequent medical examiner would revise the cause of death to restraint asphyxia, the compression of her chest while she had been held from behind in a particular position. The bathtub, on that revised reading, had been the scene of the attack, but not the instrument of her death. What both rulings agreed on, from the earliest autopsy in 1995 forward, was that Mary Catherine Edwards had been murdered. The official cause was revised. The fact of her murder was not. The Beaumont police and the Texas Rangers, who would eventually lead the investigation, opened what they expected would be a fairly rapid case. She was a young woman killed in her own apartment by a man who had handcuffed her. She had been restrained, assaulted, and left to die. Someone who knew her, they reasoned early, was likely to have done it. The physical evidence at the scene did not point to anyone they knew. There were latent DNA traces, small biological fragments left by her attacker during the course of the assault. These were collected. In 1995, they were run through the early Texas databases. They matched no one. They were run again in 1996. They matched no one. They would be run over the following 26 years against every expanded database that came online in the state of Texas. They would match no one. The man who had killed Mary Catherine Edwards had left no other prints anywhere else. By 2020, the case was officially cold. In that year, the Austin Police Department and the Texas Rangers jointly reopened the file. They offered a $6,000 reward for information. They also, quietly, submitted the preserved DNA samples to a private laboratory in Houston called Othram, a laboratory that specialized in what it called forensic-grade genome sequencing, a technique that could develop substantially more detailed genetic profiles from older, partial samples than conventional testing could. Othram returned within months, a profile detailed enough to be loaded into consumer genealogy databases. Through those databases, working with a family tree analyst, the Texas Rangers began to narrow down the pool of men who could have left the DNA in Mary's apartment. The pool narrowed to one name: Clayton Bernard Foreman, born in Beaumont, class of 1979 at Forest Park High School, married in the summer of 1982 to a bride whose wedding party had included, among other friends of hers from high school, a young woman named Mary Catherine Edwards and her twin sister Allison. Texas Ranger Brandon Bess and his partner drove to Ohio in April of 2021. They parked near Foreman's house. They waited for him to bring his garbage out to the curb. When he did, and when he went back inside, they took the garbage. Inside the garbage were 2 discarded soda cans. On the soda cans, Othram recovered DNA. The DNA on the soda cans was an exact match for the DNA from Mary Catherine Edwards' apartment in 1995. On April 15, 2021, Ranger Bess and his partner arrested Clayton Foreman at his home in Ohio. Before they took him out to the car, Bess placed on Foreman's wrists, behind his back, the pair of handcuffs that had been recovered from Mary's body at the scene of the murder in 1995. The handcuffs were a specific model. They had been part of the evidence in cold storage since the original autopsy. They had never belonged to the Beaumont Police Department. They had belonged to the man who had brought them into Mary's apartment. He was now wearing them. "It is," Bess told CBS News in an interview for the 48 Hours episode that aired after the conviction, "a moment I will never forget. It felt like I had, in some physical sense, done something for Catherine." Foreman did not testify at his trial. The prosecution presented 73 witnesses over the course of 7 court sessions. One of the witnesses was Foreman himself, in the form of a recorded statement given during his initial interview with investigators in Ohio. On the recording, asked if he had known Mary Catherine Edwards, Foreman had first denied it. Under further questioning, he had admitted that he had, that she and her sister Allison had been in his wedding party in 1982. He would subsequently offer no explanation for why, in 1995, his DNA had been found in her apartment. The defense case at trial relied primarily on challenging the DNA science. The jury did not accept those challenges. One additional piece of evidence the state introduced, over objection by the defense, concerned a conviction Foreman had received in 1985. A decade before Mary's death, he had raped a woman in Beaumont. He had offered her a ride. She had accepted. He had driven her to an isolated location. He had bound her hands with a belt. He had held a knife. The woman had survived. Foreman had received probation. In the trunk of his car at the time of his 1985 arrest, investigators had recorded in the inventory a pair of handcuffs and a firearm. The pattern, the ride, the restraint, the weapon, the assault, was the same pattern he had, according to the state's theory at the 2024 trial, reproduced 10 years later in Mary Catherine Edwards' apartment. The jury heard that. The jury heard the DNA. The jury heard the 73 witnesses. They convicted Clayton Bernard Foreman of capital murder on March 18, 2024. They sentenced him to life in prison. He will not be eligible for parole consideration until the year 2061. He will be 100 years old. In January of 2026, the Ninth Court of Appeals of Texas affirmed the conviction on every ground. The appeal had challenged the admission of the 1985 rape evidence. It had challenged the revised cause of death ruling. It had challenged the chain of custody on the DNA from the soda cans. It had not challenged the core fact of the DNA match itself. Every challenge was rejected. The conviction stood. Mary Catherine Edwards was 31 years old when she died. She had been teaching at Price Elementary for several years. Her students would, at the time she was killed, have been in their late 30s and early 40s by the time the man who had murdered her was finally put in handcuffs. Allison Edwards, Mary's twin, sat in the courtroom in 2024 through every day of the trial. She heard the 73 witnesses. She heard the recorded interview in which Clayton Foreman admitted that he had known her sister, that Mary had stood in his wedding in a yellow dress in the summer of 1982 when all of them had been young. At the sentencing, Allison delivered a victim impact statement. It was the first time since the morning her parents had gone to check on Mary in 1995 and had not returned, that the family had been asked to speak on the record about what had been lost. It had been 29 years. Brandon Bess, the Texas Ranger who had put the handcuffs on Clayton Foreman in 2021, has said in interviews since that he considered that single action to be the most meaningful arrest of his career. "You do not expect," he told CBS News, "that a beautiful young teacher is going to be murdered in her own home. You also do not expect that, 26 years later, the man who killed her will be the groom from her own best friend's wedding." The handcuffs are now, once again, in cold storage. They sit in an evidence box in the Texas Department of Public Safety. They are cataloged. They are preserved. They are, for the legal record, the single object that connected a young woman killed in Beaumont in 1995 to a man who had driven from Ohio to kill her, 13 years after asking her to stand beside him at his wedding. They held her. They eventually held him.